Hello from Yepyeni Türkiye. I have here with me Executive Director of the Tricontinental Institute, a Globetrotter contributor, Vijay Prashad. Woo! His latest book, The Withdrawal, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and the Fragility of US Power, that he wrote with Noam Chomsky, came out last year. I also strongly recommend Washington Boots and Arab Spring Libyan Winter, especially to our Turkish audience, as the events described in these two played a significant part in creating Turkey of today. With that, I want to move to Turkey's today. After the catastrophic earthquakes and Erdogan's failure to respond for the first 2 days of it, it seems like if we still have elections, Erdogan is gonzo. But after his departure, CHP will be replacing him probably. But also with the earthquake, we are very ripe for disaster capitalism. Do you think Turkey's future is going to be just a switch from order nationalist Orban-like regime of Erdogan to an order liberal regime instead?
Well, first, it's a 7.8 magnitude earthquake in an area of some relative congestion. This is not a rural area. I mean, this is an urbanized area along the border. I've traveled there about 10 years ago when I was covering the war in Syria. The devastation both in Turkey and in Syria has been quite astounding. 7.8 magnitude earthquakes take place in other places, but in this particular place, with this kind of population density, estimates as we speak are about 40,000 dead. Before we began, you said it'll go up to 100,000. That's not a unlikely number. Hospitals collapsed. People are just not being found. And when they count casualties, 40,000. That's 40,000 bodies that they found. There'll be a lot of people just not found because they'll be under mountains of rubble. For a very long time. This is a terrible, terrible catastrophe. The catastrophe is, of course, for Syria in a way that's unimaginable because for the first time in a very long time, the International Organization of Migration was able to, get a convoy, to go across the Bab al-Salam crossing. The Bab al-Salam crossing has been closed for a long time. And in fact, this aid, $300-400 million of aid to the region from the UN is a drop in the bucket. It's going to need a lot more to recover. It's hard for me to think about these earthquakes in political terms, particularly because they are such humanitarian catastrophes. And one very much hopes that in the short term, not just both, but the government in Turkey, led by Erdogan, the government in Syria, led by Bashar al-Assad, the rebel groups in the northern part of Syria, especially, that are in Idlib, that are kind of garrisoned in Idlib, the United Nations. I very much hope that everybody is going to focus on the survivors of this earthquake as a primary matter. I mean, it's extraordinary that the United States didn't immediately lift the sanctions on Syria. Emergency lifting of sanctions.
They don't do that. COVID didn't make them do that. No, it's never.
Yeah, it is extraordinary. I mean, that this should have been just the first thing. A 1 month window of sanction lifting in order to get all kinds of aid, but more than anything, for people to send money to the country. Ordinary people are worried and they say things on social media and elsewhere. How do we help? How do we contribute? I know there was a link I circulated to the Izmir municipality. In Turkey, it's possible. In Syria, it's impossible. Channels of finance are not open. So the first thing I would say is that, I very much hope it'll be all hands on deck to help people out. You asked a question about possibility of this being the final blow on the coffin of the Erdogan government. I don't know Turkey as well as you do, and your listeners will know Turkey much better than I. But I would also like to caution us about thinking about, precipitous disappearance of people like Erdogan or Mr. Modi in India. These are fighters, they know how to survive. And they are able to, at the last instance, pull a rabbit out of the hat. So, yes, the Republicans, they've been the party, or, putting themselves forward as a kind of rational alternative for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just this election. You'll remember in the last election, the understanding was, well, this time Erdogan is done and the Republicans are going to come in and so on. And no, Erdogan prevailed again. So
Mhm.
I would be cautious about believing that, these are the final months of Erdogan's governance in Turkey.
That's optimism.
I mean, I'm with you in the optimism. I don't want to dull the optimism. On the other hand, let's be also a little honest with ourselves that, forces like Erdogan, Modi, and others, they have been able to build a constituency around concepts like piety,
Yeah.
pious neoliberalism, the prosperity gospel. I mean, look, Erdogan comes out of the Muslim Brotherhood tradition.
Mhm.
Whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood or it's Pentecostalism, in the world of Christianity and so on, these are, in a sense, prosperity gospels. They
Yeah.
go amongst people, pious people who are anxious about developments in the modern world, and they tell them, look, we'll protect you from the modern world,
Mhm.
and you can work hard and make money. The deal is, you give me political power, I'll protect you from uncertainties in the modern world, the things your children are watching on the internet. I'll help you discipline your children.
Yeah.
We will protect your children from social things that worry you. Maybe the question of sex, or the question of various personal freedoms and so on. We'll protect your children. Don't worry, you don't have to parent them. I will be the father in chief for your family. But on the other hand, I will also make it possible for you to make a decent living. That's the deal of this sort of pious neoliberal bloc.
Mhm.
And their constituency is not being peeled away. In other
Yeah.
words, people in that bloc might feel like, oh, I don't like this, or I don't like that about Modi or Erdogan, or whatever. But the Republicans or other forces, including the left, are not coming out there and saying, hey, listen, we have an answer to your anxiety.
In your book, Washington Bullets, you have described a coalition of the old guard, basically, like the landowners and the religious leaders, the old capital, etc. Like they can come together against the interest of the public, and they do. So another thing with Erdogan is that even if he and along with him, political Islam was to become, there is a populist wave of nationalism that is also spreading in different variations across the world, largely disseminated through Steve Bannon adjacent online QAnonish culture.
So, for instance, what you said right now is important. Look, you can't defeat the coalition of piety by saying that they are horrible people, or by saying that, Erdogan is a dangerous. You can't defeat that coalition by claiming that they are bad, okay, or by disrespecting them, which is what sometimes happens in the world of the liberals.
Mhm.
The liberals will try to win out of horror.
Yeah.
My God, they are terrible. The
Mhm.
barbarians are at the gates and so on. You don't win like that. You have to win by offering an alternative project. And what is your alternative project? Let's sell everything in the country to private capital. That's not a project. I mean, as I said, people have legitimate anxieties about the world today. Okay, all around the world, people have legitimate anxieties. They're worried about what's going to happen to their children. They're worried about the climate. They're worried about the fact that there's declining incomes in many countries. These are real, genuine. I mean, they're worried about, if even in their small towns the traffic has become terrible. Even in their small towns, it's difficult to for difficult for young people to have safe places to go and hang out. These are legitimate worries. So what is your project? And right now it seems to me, in many of the countries which face these so-called strong men as leaders, the opposition merely says that the strong man is horrible. And I have never seen the opposition able to galvanize a public on the politics of the strong man is horrible. Look at Lula as an example. Lula had a marginal victory. It's basically the north of Brazil voted Lula, but the entire populated south voted for Bolsonaro. very high percentages. So it was not really a defeat of Bolsonarism. Bolsonaro lost the election, but Bolsonarism remains intact. And it's at the gates banging hard against Lula's ability to drive a project forward. So it's not enough to just win the next election. You see, Erdoganism is rooted itself in Anatolia. And, maybe Istanbul doesn't tolerate Erdoganism. I remember traveling to Kurdish majority regions in the northeast of the southeast of the country, Kurdish majority regions where Kurdish political figures were pro-Erdogan. Initially, that surprised me a little. I wasn't clear. And then I realized this has to do with piety. You see, because it's not like the Kurdish it's, how sometimes online you'll get anarchists talking about the Kurds as if they are, universally some sort of socialist, anarchist kind of... That's nonsense. It's
most
largely
of
a
them
greatly...
conservative people.
Yeah, it's a very pious community, with Orthodox Sunni type religious leaders, but also some heterodox religious leaders who also truck in piety. So in that sense, Erdoganism is rooted in the small towns of Anatolia. And you may actually get the people not to vote for Erdogan, but Erdoganism is going to outlive the election. So the question is, you want to actually transcend Erdoganism or Modiism in India or Bolsonaroism in thing or whatever. You got to have an alternative project. You have to actually, you don't pander, and I think this is a good word to use. You don't pander to the prejudices of the lower middle class in Anatolia, but you still have to answer their questions. You don't go in there and say, okay, we are also against homosexuality. No, that's outrageous. That's an outrageous, because then you're pandering to their various ideas. I'm not saying that all of the lower middle class in Anatolia is homophobic, but homophobia plays a role in this. Okay, we worry about our children being, in Bolsonaro's case, when he ran against Fernando Haddad, he directly picked this up and said that the left is going to teach your children about homosexuality. He used to directly say this. Now, we can't pander to that. On the other hand, we have to somehow answer the question that, look, your children are not in danger, of having a moral collapse. Okay, relax. How do you address those anxieties, fears around another project? And that's what I want to say. I'm not being pessimistic. The reason I feel I'm being realistic is this is not just about one election. This is about actually transforming the political and moral balance of forces in a country that is as important as Turkey. Turkey is a very important country right now.
Oh, yeah.
Erdogan is playing a very interesting role in terms of foreign relations. He is actually driving a kind of foreign relations that's not entirely pro-NATO. It's playing an interest. It's actually living up to its role of being partly in Asia, partly in Europe. It's kind of playing a Janus-based foreign policy. And that's interesting. So what's the left's, positioning there and so on. So, yeah, I'm saying to you and people who, are around you that the question has always got to be, how do you produce a different project, which is actually not merely yelling and screaming that Bolsonaro is bad or Bolsonaro is actually pro-NATO, because these are not credible arguments. How do we create a different kind of politics?
As we have seen in Lava Jato, in Lula's case, for example, or Jeremy Corbyn's case, Paul Mason, I think, kind of like acted as an informant. Whenever some genuine populism and a positive agenda galvanizes people, it starts with intelligence agencies, like this, it goes all the way up to eventual coups, as you have described in Washington Bulls. I believe the joke you have told was, why isn't there ever a coup in American soil? Because there is no American embassy there. I mean, we do have one. So General Rogers visited 4 times right before the coup in 80. Other main opposition party in Turkey is, for example, a very NATO adjacent Youth Atlantic Treaty Organization, stuff like that. All of the upper level is like coming from those institutes, etc. I wonder how much underhanded stuff would be waiting for potential true populists in Turkey.
Look, you well know. In 2016, you remember the what was called the attempted military coup in
Mhm.
Turkey. The Peace at Home Council was
Yeah.
supposed to have acted. It's amazing. That was 2016, right? That's what, 7 years ago. Can you name for me 10 people who were in the Peace at Home
Hmm.
Council?
Yeah.
I don't think we know anything about the Peace at Home Council, the most mysterious attempted coup d'etat. I have no idea what the hell happened, but I'm going to come off as if I am politically all over the place. But I thought at that moment, oh, interesting, because there's the US base, and maybe Erdogan was slipping a little too far away from the NATO leash, and maybe this was like a message to Erdogan, whatever. But man, that guy took advantage of that. Whatever the hell it was. Was it a manufactured event? Was it a real attempted coup? I don't.
We can't be sure either.
Well, the reason I can't be sure is I don't know who did the coup.
Yeah.
Because they
Exactly.
never actually told us who Peace at Home was. We just were told there is something called Peace at Home, right? As
Mhm.
far as I remember, they didn't march out the leader and say, well, this is the leader of this council. It just, now people have just sort of forgotten the fact of it. But he used it brilliantly. You may remember the HDP offices were attacked.
Mhm.
The arrests of HDP leaders and so on. Somehow the linkage between, and this is, you see, it became useful to Erdogan because around this time the United States was operating alongside Kurdish forces in northern Syria.
Mhm.
And he could then put all these things into a really interesting
Yeah.
scoop to do his pivot, where he pivots away from the attempted overthrow of Bashar al-Assad's government, which Erdogan was in the lead from 2012 when he hosted the Muslim Brotherhood leadership of Syria in Istanbul.
Mhm.
From 2012 right to about 2016, he was in the lead. Assad
Yeah.
would go and so on. The military coup happens, he pivots, and it's very interesting use of an event. Now, again,
Mhm.
I don't know what that event was, and I don't want to speculate, and because I really don't know. We don't have the facts of it, so we can tell any story when there are no facts around something. You could basically concoct any story, and that's sad, because
Mhm.
as Marxists we have to build theory from the facts, and the facts here are that something happened, a name was given to the leadership, we don't know who the hell they are, we don't even know if the coup was real,
Mhm.
but what we do know, in the aftermath there was a crackdown and political space was taken away. Now that was, I think, quite important because I don't know what your views are about the HDP or other political forces, but
Mhm.
it was important to see the emergence of a left electoral front emerge to the left of the Republicans. I think that was very important for enriching Turkish democracy, to have a left front that was not entirely Kurdish, that wasn't ethnicized. I mean,
Mhm.
you know, going back to the 1970s, there's been this left Kurdish attempt to create political parties. The HDP doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of decades of this left Kurdish alliance building,
Mhm.
which has been going on. And I think the crushing of the HDP, which I don't know what your feeling is, but it was really damaged.
Yeah.
It's the absence of the dynamic of the center left in Turkey that is actually going to prevent the creation of an authentic new project for the Turkish people. Because as you said at the beginning, the Republicans don't have a clue how to put forward a real new project. They will return, as you said, with a
Yeah.
neoliberal project. So I feel personally, from what my understanding in travels to Turkey, that the absence of the left center left as a mass force, with an electoral character, is going to damage the ability to uproot Erdoganism.
Global politics, right? International politics. So I have noticed that you also kind of acknowledge that under the hegemony of USA, it will not be very easy to move forward with a truly populist project. I have seen in several places you mentioning the need for a new non-aligned movement, and I also see you making emphasis on regionality, production chains, energy, food. These should be localized as much as possible, and like a degrowth paradigm with climate justice should be adopted in general. But also, I feel like there should be a global non-aligned movement in order to push back against coups. And I also feel like earlier we have talked about some of the strongman characters. You might even have to sometimes side with them in such a construction, I would say, because otherwise
Politics is a complicated business. Okay, it's not a clean straight line. History doesn't move in straight lines. Engels said it moves in zigs and zags. Obviously, one has to make all kinds of alliances. Humanity again doesn't line up properly. In his political writings on France, Marx made a very interesting, astute observation that in fact, on the terrain of politics, class doesn't appear without clothes. That I am the party of the working class. I am the party of the peasants. I am the party of the bankers or the bourgeoisie or whatever. No, it's never like that. All political formations in the democratic era appear as cross-class parties. You can't say, for instance, that Erdogan's People's Alliance, for instance, is the party of the bourgeoisie. That's not true. Lots of workers are within the fold of Erdoganism. Lots of peasants are in the fold of miners, even though, Erdoganism has been ruthless against the mining sector, the miners will be in that thing and so on.
Plantas Miliband type of situation, yeah.
Well, in Labor and Freedom, for instance, the new alliance of the HDP and the communists and so on in this election this year, you'll also have sections of the Istanbul bourgeoisie, which is feeling, they would want a more rational politics. They may not like the HDP, they may not like the left, but, they don't want Erdoganism. They're kind of fed up with it. The human rights stuff, the random things he says, whatever. Class doesn't appear unmediated onto the political stage. It comes with all kinds of mediations and complexities. As a consequence of that, when you build alliances, like for instance, I am not a defender of the Iranian government. I am not in favor of any kind of theocratic government. Of course, I defend the Iranian people against an attack by the United States and Israel and all of that. But also, I understand why, when the group of friends in defense of the UN Charter was created, created by Venezuela, which is led by a socialist process, I understand why they invite Iran to the table, because they have a common position there. Turkey, for instance, governed by the right, has a very close relationship with Venezuela, with Cuba and so on. Turkish Airlines, and here's an ad, one of the world's best airlines, I would say, flies directly from Istanbul to Caracas. It's one of the few airlines that does that. So Turkey, for whatever problems one has with the Erdogan government, entered into a kind of understanding that state sovereignty is important. Okay, so you end up at the level of political alliances on a global stage, making some pretty curious alliances. This is just the nature of politics. I mean, the fact that the closest ally of the United States in Asia is Saudi Arabia, that's a curious alliance. But these are the alliances of history, that have you have to have a recognition of it. So you can't build the future by being pure on everything. You're gonna have to understand there are primary contradictions, secondary contradictions, and so on. The primary contradiction today is US imperialism, versus humanity. That's a primary contradiction. And if in the camp of humanity, you're going to have people there who you dislike politically, well, that's just what it's going to have to be. As I said, Iran is a really good example. I have the greatest respect for the Iranian people. I think it's an incredible country. I also think that Iran is more complicated than the Western media makes it out to be. There are all kinds of political forces in the country. But I don't like theocracy. That's a personal and political opinion. I'm opposed to theocratic governments. That's my own opinion.
I mean, that's your choice. I don't agree, but okay.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are people who like theocratic governments, and that's their understanding. But that doesn't mean that one at a certain point doesn't work with them on some issues. And I think that's, like Mr. Modi would like to put me in a prison cell, but that doesn't mean that I don't see that at certain moments even the Indian government under Modi is doing certain things. I mean, Modi might not like me, but last year he quoted from a speech I gave. That's a curiosity. Why did Modi quote from a speech that I, a Marxist, a communist, delivered at a COP meeting? Well, he quoted it because what I was saying was something he agreed with at that moment. So, politics is about creating blocks and coalitions and being able to be supple enough to move and not be rigid. I find that there are sections of the left that have been infected with the disease of purism. And purity is okay. You can be pure. You'll be happy all your life, but you're not building anything. I'm interested in changing the world, not in being correct all the time.
Exactly. We need to be pragmatic. Social democracy is still a win compared to today's Turkey. It's not social fascism, guys.
Last devastating earthquake, we saw the USA send an aircraft carrier. Was it a show of power? Also, they sent the USA aid. Should we worry about it?
Now, if USAID money is coming in to help in the immediate period, that's okay. But if the USAID wants to set up an office and start, helping in rebuilding and reconstruction, you don't want that. You want USAID money to come in, fine. It comes to Red Crescent Society. That's okay. But reconstruction must be done through municipalities, not through NGOs or foreign, agencies. But that's why I was on Twitter telling people, donate to the Izmir municipality. Let local government be an important agent in the rebuilding of themselves, because that's democratic. We don't want to have like any foundations from abroad coming in and dictating the terms of rebuilding. Well, we'll rebuild a hospital, but it must be a private hospital. We'll rebuild a school, but it must be a private school. I mean, you referred to at the beginning, disaster capitalism. You use that phrase. It's to use the destruction of public infrastructure to privatize it. That's just not, that's inhumane. Don't politicize an event like this. In fact, my feeling is, if things were in the public domain before, let them be in the public domain. If there was a private hospital, okay, build a private hospital again. But don't use a catastrophe to change the terms of social life.
I can guarantee you that before they started organizing the rescue efforts, they were already planning who to contract for which infrastructure element, unfortunately.
Some lady was rescued from the rubble. Her first words were, don't bring me to a private hospital. I don't have money.
It's a very real thing. And by the way, one of the catastrophic outcomes of this earthquake might be that, already, I think the election was to be, your presidential election was to be 18th of June. Already they have said they're going to postpone it. And, I mean, I get it. What is it? How many provinces are there in Turkey?
81.
81.
Yeah, so 10 to 15 of them have been impacted by the earthquake, at least 10. So that's 1 in 8 Turks. Well, no, that's not correct, because they are not evenly distributed by population, but 1 in 8 provinces have been impacted. And so I understand it's difficult to go into an election, but it's only February 15th, February, March, April, May.
A lot of damage can be done.
Away to go. I was looking at a couple of Turkish newspapers and I saw, well, they're thinking of postponing the election. Well, that's one of the outcomes that is perhaps not a good one. You know, although I'm not really sure that the opposition is prepared to enter this election.
Oh yeah, no, they are not. They are doing quite horribly too. But like at this point, I mean, an empty chair is much better than what we have. So but you have brought up Syrian areas affected earlier. Us, the Turks, at least have the power of vote, and like they are somehow beholden to us. But in the Turkish controlled areas of northern Syria, they don't have even that. And I don't know what help is going there. I don't think a lot.
I mean, I don't know what the is going to happen in those areas, Turkish control areas or rebel controlled areas in Idlib. I don't know. I don't even know what the scale of the damage has been in Idlib. I'm not sure. I was focusing a little bit earlier on the U.S. Sanctions. I know that the U.S. Treasury has said that some sanctions should be lifted, but I've been through this dance before.
Yeah.
When the hurricane struck Cuba, the U.S. government said, "Well, we'll lift some," but they didn't really. It was really very weak in terms of what they did, and that's something to consider. Like I read the Treasury Department U.S. Treasury Department statement where they said we will not stand in the way of saving Syrian lives. Well, okay, but you are, and your mild lifting of this or that is not going to do it.
Madeleine Albright said for 500,000 children dying because of the sanctions on Iraq, it was a price worth paying. So we know that like they have a pretty high threshold. I think Afghanistan right now has like 35 million people in the danger of dying of hunger, but still their own money is actually like this. I'm not talking about aid money or anything. They just took away their money.
In much of northern Syria, where you mentioned Turkish controlled northern Syria, but much of the earthquake damage was in the rebel controlled towns of Idlib and bits of Aleppo. And something like 4/5 of the known casualties in Syria have been in that area. And I would like to say that in many of those parts, the groups that were there really neglected the municipal their municipal obligations.
Yeah.
From journalist friends who have been into Idlib in the last period say it's a wreck. It's a wreck.
They randomly introduce taxes from crossing of the border, etc. I don't know how we are going to stop working with those crowds. That's not gonna be very easy either, though, because like Sadat, a paramilitary Blackwater-like organization, that's it's gonna be very rough, man.
Yeah, I mean, I met some of those groups in just on the Turkish side of the border in 2014 that are now in Idlib. I mean, there are all. I mean, I'll be pretty straightforward with you. I found them to be both disturbing, dangerous, but also a little crazy. These are groups that are. Many of them were kind of former.
Mercenaries.
They were kind of Al-Qaeda-esque groups that came out of the camps in Afghanistan. In fact, it's interesting. The Uyghur militant groups have their headquarters in Idlib. Not in Urumqi or not in Central Asia. Their headquarters in Idlib, and these guys are pretty nuts. Frankly, and they just as in some towns that I have visited in the Sahel region where the in control, their general appetite for municipal works is low.
Exact same pattern of jihadist creation in Sahel region as well.
I mean, I think it's a tragedy, and we're going to have to find a way out of this. You and I can't solve these problems, but what you and I can do is we can raise these questions in the public domain, and maybe that'll help build certain kinds of political pressure. We can't solve this ourselves. It's simply not possible. And I think sometimes a lot of people on the left have discussions and debates as if their views are going to solve things. No, we hold discussions and debates so that we can educate people and you build the kind of necessary political force to change the balance of forces, but I mean, some of this just breaks my heart. Idlib and Aleppo were great cities of Syria. Aleppo was a terrific city. I visited Aleppo before the uprisings that took place in the Arab world, and it was a mixed city, including people from the old communities, the old Christian communities of Syria. Very interesting places. And what had begun to happen in Aleppo before the Arab Spring was that when the drought took place in northern Syria, large number of refugees came into Aleppo, and for some unknown reason, again, to help people, I suppose, the Syrian government allowed Saudi preachers to set up mosques for relief in Aleppo, and that was that was really bad politics, because that's like allowing USAID to have a permanent office. Take the Saudi money in a time of crisis, but don't let them come and build their mosques and start proselytizing. And at the same time, of course, the Turks had their brotherhood allies in that region, preaching and saying all kinds of things. But that alliance, and boy, I hope one day we'll return to do a proper diagnosis of the strange alliance between Turkey and Saudi Arabia against the Syrian government. So strange, because the Turkish government and the Saudi government, they don't see eye to eye on almost all social issues, and yet they united to overthrow the Assad government. Such an interesting moment. That alliance didn't last long, because as you remember, there was that fight between Qatar and Turkey on one side and Saudi Arabia on the other. Finally, the gap between Saudi, or the Salafi tendency and the Ikhwan tendency opened up. But there was that alliance, and I remember in 2012 discussing with people saying, well, this is a world historical alliance. It's so strange, because even in at the time in Egypt, you may remember in 2011-12, it looked like there was going to be an alliance between the Saudis and the Turks to back the Brotherhood government, but that fell apart. And then of course you got General Sisi paid by the Saudis to take out Morsi, backed by the Turks. I remember well in that period when Turkish diplomats used to talk about the new Ottomanism. And I'd be like, really, guys, you got to really take it easy. The Ottoman Empire collapsed 100 years ago. Take it easy, guys. Take it easy.
No, we are very maximalist in our, imperial ambitions. I mean, last year, in order for Somalia's president not to leave their seat following an election, we have donated arms in the ballpark of $30 million, I believe, which is more than what we spend on renewable energies, for example. But the problem is a lot of these, especially the ecological ones, they are very irreversible, like cyanide gold of Alamos Gold, a Canadian firm. Goddamn Canadians, they are like looking for gold all over the globe. And and they are like always, trying to appear like, we are super sensitive, we face our atrocities. First of all, stop your atrocities, guys. Then we can work our way from that.
That's funny. Well, I also want to say that, Turkey does have a very interesting and important history. And, I don't need to tell you that, but I think, it's a history worth claiming. The other day I pulled, I don't read Turkish, but I pulled out of my bookshelf a very fine novel, by Yashar Kemal.
One of my favorites.
And, God, the important literary traditions, the important, and by the way, everything is in Pamuk. I highly recommend to people, if they haven't read Kemal, this is a great writer.
That's the first book of İnce Mehmet, this guy is shooting an Feolar Lord, right? That's the
Well, I was in Havana just a few days ago, and in Havana, I went into a restaurant where they had a giant picture of Hikmet, and they had quotes from Hikmet, and they had other Turkish writers. This is in Havana.
Yeah.
I mean, the Turkish people have a lot to be proud of. It's a great heritage. There's ugly things in every country. You have it's a country that has fought coup upon coup. The bravery of the Turkish left and ordinary people, workers who fought against coup upon coup upon coup.
So many of them put their lives on the line. Actually, that is one of our core missions. What we are trying to do. In one of your speeches, I believe it was "What to Do in a Burning World." You have said I'm not gonna make a TikTok video explaining this, so you guys don't know this. I'm the guy making that video.
Oh, okay. Well, but the point I want to make in this is that the left in many of our countries is trying to separate itself from nationalism, and I think that's a mistake. I think we should not, in the name of internationalism, we should not reject our heritage and our people and our culture and our world. And I think the Turkish left should inhabit its own complexities, but also the greatness of it, and because there's a lot there to be learned from. As I said, it's so interesting and important to see how generation after generation has attempted to address the social question and the national question, or the minority question, in a united way. The HDP being, the most recent attempt at that. But more than that, I mean, the great histories of struggle, the terrific history of working class Istanbul, for instance. There's a lot to excavate. The left should not take a position condemning Turkey because they want to condemn Erdoganism.
That is something actually I want to get at. In the leftist platforms throughout the internet, the reaction to this earthquake was kind of alienating to me. I didn't know what to feel about that. I get it, we do a lot of colonialist things, especially in Afrin region, for example. We forced the kids to go to Turkish language classes. Not cool, not chill. If it was up to me, wouldn't do it. But because of that, showing zero solidarity in this moment of crisis with Turks, that's Cuba, of course, came. They do always every time there is a crisis. But besides that, especially online left is super toxic about this. But
it's too bad, because as I just want to repeat that, it's really important to build every class has to come to terms with its own nation. That's the only way history moves forward. There is no internationalism that doesn't have to also go through the nation, because the national container exists and is there. And part of that is creating your own great history. Is there a people's history of Turkey? Is there a way to understand that actually it's the working class and peasantry that built Turkey? Turkey is a product. All those beautiful mosques and palaces in Istanbul were built by ordinary people. When I travel to Istanbul and I say, I want to go to Topkapi, people say, why would you go there? It's a terrible, and I'm like, no, it's a place where ordinary artisans built a beautiful structure. And inside Topkapi, inside the various beautiful rooms, the mosaic work, that's anonymous working class artists, boss. That's the Turkish heritage. You can't just dismiss it because of who lived there. I don't care who lived there. Even the mosques in Istanbul, they are beautiful. They are, in fact, the epitome of working class people's art. When you go just walking the streets of the cities and you see, you're surprised, you turn a corner and you see a beautiful building. I remember with great joy taking a boat from the dock, on the Topkapi side, out to the very edge of the Black Sea. You know,
Mhm.
that port that goes up,
Yeah.
and along the way you see these old Ottoman mansions against the Bosphorus. They are just beautiful, and I don't say, oh, they are beautiful, they are a reflection of the Ottoman past. No, they are the best of the working class artisans who crafted and constructed those buildings. And that's what I want to just say. You know, I know I'm going to leave you in a little bit, but one has to find a way to be proud of your own histories and your people, because a left cannot build a project if it takes an antithetical position against its own culture. You know, and sometimes, and I'm saying this specifically in the context of Turkey, because sometimes our friends who belong to a world like Istanbul have an elitist orientation to the rest of Anatolia. And that elitist orientation isn't going to win you friends in the small towns, you know, where cassettes continue to travel. Some of those cassettes carry the, and by the way, it's still in cassettes, because I saw cassettes 10 years ago
Yeah.
being sold in the bazaars.
Mhm.
In cassettes, you'll get the lectures by, you know, pious, well, maybe pretend pious, Maulvis telling you about what Islam, you know, demands of you. But then there are also cassettes that are handed around with like old speeches of Kurdish leaders and so on, that are Kurdish nationalists in one way or the other. I mean, you know, we have to participate in those debates. We can't just condemn a people because of the political leadership that exists. You know, be proud of of the struggles of working people. So I expect next time I come and talk to you, you'll already have written the book called A People's History of Turkey.
I hope so.
Yes, that goes back to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and tells the story of industrial workers, artisans, tells the story of peasants, tells the story of, you know, the Kurdish women that smuggle goods across the borders so their families can survive. I
Yeah.
want to read that book.
I mean, that would be a wonderful project. We had actually something similar in the works that goes back to World War II. You know, we take it in installments. Well, it will be like a bundle of videos, articles, couple of people. Maybe some of them get translated and I will send them to you.
Beautiful. I look forward to publishing that book at Leftward Books in Delhi. I really do look forward to it.
That would be amazing.
Okay, guys, I'm going to have to leave you in a minute. And so, first, I want to thank you a lot. Where's your puppet again? I
Oh,
really like the idea of this Marxist sock puppet.
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean, it's a sock puppet, you know, but this time he's a Marxist. Cool
Look,
guy.
even sock puppets have ideologies, and this sock puppet has a science, not an ideology.
There
So
you
that's
go.
even better, you know. Okay, nice to talk with you, and
Likewise.
stay in touch with me, and we'll chat again someday.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
It
Bye.
was delightful.